The faint echoes of screams pierce the tranquil Melbourne morning. A concerned neighbor dials emergency services, unable to determine the origin of the cries. Little do investigators know, this chilling call marks the start of a dark odyssey into the twisted mind of a ruthless serial killer. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us again at Crimeco. Here, we meticulously dissect some of the most chilling true crime cases from every corner of the globe, providing you with the most recent and in-depth information. If this sparks your interest, we would be delighted if you could subscribe to our channel. Also, giving this video a like significantly supports our channel's growth. We appreciate your help. Now, let's plunge into today's intriguing case. Peter Norris Dupas was born on July 6, 1953 in Sydney, Australia. He was the youngest of 3 children born to his parents, who have not been publicly named. Dupas grew up in a middle-class family that treated him like an only child since his siblings were much older. His family moved to Melbourne, Victoria when he was still a young toddler. He attended school through 10th grade before leaving to complete his higher school certificate later on. Dupas was described as coming from a fairly normal family as a child, with no early signs of the disturbed compulsions that would later dominate his life. On October 3, 1968, at the young age of 15, Dupas committed his chilling first attack on a woman, his female next-door neighbor. He requested to borrow a knife under the pretense of peeling vegetables, then used it to ruthlessly stab her in the face, neck, and hands instead. This unprovoked act of extreme violence provided the first glimpse into the profound psychological issues brewing under Dupas' innocent exterior. After the attack, Dupas chillingly told police that he felt helpless to control his violent urges, saying, "I could not help myself and did not know why I began to attack the woman." For this horrific first crime, Dupas received a remarkably light sentence of just 18 months probation. At this young age, the warning signs were clear regarding Dupas' propensity for impulsive violence against women. But tragically, they went unheeded by the justice system. Dupas' violent compulsions rapidly escalated in severity throughout the 1970s. In July 1974, he broke into a woman's home, threatened her baby, and committed a horrific rape at knife point. This earned him 5 to 9 years in prison. Psychiatrists ominously warned authorities that Dupas was in total denial about his crimes and posed an extreme risk of reoffending. Their warnings were ignored. In 1979, just months after his release, Dupas committed 4 more attacks on women over a 10-day period. He was imprisoned again in 1980, but continued displaying an unnerving lack of remorse, fooling prison psychiatrists into believing he was rehabilitated. This cycle repeated itself throughout the 1980s. Mere weeks after Dupas' release from his 3rd prison stint in 1985, he committed yet another horrific rape of a young woman at knife point on a Victoria beach. Even Dupas himself admitted, "Everyone was telling me I'm okay now. I never thought it was going to happen again." But the worst was still to come. After attacking numerous women and serving various prison terms through the 1980s, Dupas was once again released in the mid-1990s, primed to launch his deadly serial killing spree. 28-year-old Nicole Patterson worked as a psychotherapist and youth counselor dedicated to helping troubled teens in Melbourne. To expand her private practice in April 1999, she placed ads in a local newspaper seeking new clients. This fateful decision led the kind-hearted Patterson directly into the trap of Peter Dupas. Posing as a depressed, gambling-addicted man named Malcolm, Dupas called Patterson's office numerous times to book counseling appointments. Dupas was setting the stage for Patterson's weeks in advance. He was meticulously learning her routines and vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That horrific moment came on the morning of April 19, 1999. Patterson had a 9 a.m. appointment scheduled with Malcolm, unaware this was actually the monstrous Dupas. Her boyfriend tried contacting her that afternoon, but there was no response. Tragically, Patterson's body was discovered by a friend who arrived at her home for a dinner engagement. Finding the front door unlocked and hearing music playing eerily from a radio, the friend entered and stumbled upon a scene of sheer brutality. Patterson had been ferociously stabbed 27 times in the chest and back. Her lower body was exposed, with her skirt discarded in a bedroom and underwear wrapped around her ankles. In his signature style, Dupas had removed Patterson's breasts with a sharp knife. The weapon and dismembered breasts were never recovered. Patterson's handbag and ID had also been stolen, demonstrating Dupas' efforts to conceal her identity. Cold-blooded and cunning as ever, Dupas had inflicted deep wounds before delivering the final death blows, intentionally maximizing Patterson's suffering. Dupas was arrested just 3 days later, after police connected him to a mobile number Patterson had written in her calendar for Malcolm. Scrapes on Dupas' hands and blood-stained clothes provided further damning evidence of his monstrous crime. An appeal of Dupas' conviction for Patterson's murder was swiftly dismissed. But this wicked man had more innocent lives to destroy before he was finished. 40-year-old Margaret Maurer struggled with drug addiction and worked as a prostitute to finance her habit. She was last seen alive by a passerby at 12:20 a.m. on October 4, 1997 in the Melbourne suburb of Broadmeadows. Maurer's battered body was discovered that afternoon concealed under a cardboard box at an industrial estate in Somerton, a northern suburb of Melbourne. She had been viciously stabbed 106 times. A black woolen glove recovered at the scene contained traces of Dupas' DNA. His fingerprints were also found inside Maurer's handbag, which he had ransacked to obliterate her identity. Consistent with Patterson's murder, Maurer's left breast had been hacked off by Dupas and stuffed into her mouth in a horrifying act of mutilation. The vulgar overkill of Maurer's attack pointed to an intensely personal aspect of Dupas' pathological hatred of women. Margaret Maurer was not just a victim of opportunity for Dupas. She represented a profound threat to his twisted psyche. Expert psychologists have theorized that sexually assertive, independent women like Maurer served as distorted surrogate targets in Dupas' mind for the overpowering maternal figures from his childhood. By savagely dominating and mutilating Maurer, Dupas achieved a symbolic victory over his own deep-seated insecurities and weaknesses. Of course, this is mere retrospect. Nothing can rationalize Dupas' atrocities. Astonishingly, by the time of Maurer's murder, Dupas had already been convicted and imprisoned for Patterson's murder earlier in 1999. But his sentence provided only a brief interruption in his relentless killing spree. An appeal of Dupas' conviction for Maurer's murder was denied, rightfully condemning this manipulative psychopath to rot in prison for the rest of his miserable life. But there was still one more innocent life this monster claimed before he was stopped forever. Marcina Halviges was a vibrant young woman, adored by her tight-knit Greek immigrant family in Melbourne. On November 1, 1997, the 25-year-old Halviges visited her grandmother's grave at a Melbourne cemetery to clean the headstone and leave fresh flowers, a routine trip that she made regularly. But Dupas was stalking the cemetery that day, seeking out potential prey. He attacked Halviges from behind as she knelt to arrange flowers, stabbing her savagely 87 times. Halviges' mangled body was found days later by her distraught fiancé, discarded in an empty plot just 3 graves from her grandmother's resting place. In a stomach-churning echo of his earlier victims, Dupas had focused his deranged fury on Halviges' breasts, maniacally hacking at them with his blade. Her clothing was pulled over her head, exposing her breasts to facilitate Dupas' ritualistic mutilation. This crime demonstrated a new level of boldness and risk-taking in Dupas' actions. While Patterson and Maurer were isolated indoors when attacked, Halveges was stalked and butchered in broad daylight in a public cemetery. Dupas' grandfather was even buried just 128 meters from where Halveges was murdered. He knew the cemetery intimately and had slaughtered Halveges right under the noses of visitors and workers. The investigation into Halveges' murder was exhaustive. Police interviewed over 1,500 people and investigated 100 initial suspects without success. A reward for information was raised first to $50,000, then $100,000, and eventually to $1 million, the highest amount ever offered in Victoria's history. The case remained unsolved for almost a decade, until two dedicated investigators reignited the trail in 2006. They uncovered new witnesses that placed Dupas at the cemetery that day and contacted prisoners who credibly implicated Dupas in confessions. Finally, in September 2006, with irrefutable evidence stacked against him, Dupas was charged with Halveges' murder. After 2 grueling trials and numerous appeals, Dupas was conclusively convicted and sentenced to his 3rd and final life sentence without parole. Marcina Halveges' murder marked the end of Dupas' decade-long killing spree. His wicked freedom to terrorize women was terminated forever. The excruciating pain felt by the families of Dupas' victims persists long after the media spotlight has faded. For George Halveges, Marcina's father, the anguish spurred him into decades of activism for victims' rights. To this day, he still visits his daughter's grave daily, refusing to let her suffering be forgotten. George became a vocal advocate to reform the justice system's shortcomings that had allowed Dupas to walk free and murder his daughter. At every appeal and hearing, George maintained a dignified presence, reminding courts of the victims' humanity and their families' lingering agony. Thanks largely to his efforts, the $1 million reward in Marcina's case still stands as the largest ever offered in Victoria's history. And the final guilty verdict came only because George never relented in his gentle pressure on authorities to pursue justice at every turn. In a moving victim impact statement after Dupas' conviction, Marcina Halveges' brother Nick summarized the sentiments of all the grieving families. Go away and never be heard of again, then rot in hell. But the family's pain didn't end there. Dupas, with his endless appeals, kept forcing them to relive their trauma when all they sought was closure. Imagine having to repeatedly listen in court to every graphic detail surrounding your loved one's murder. Imagine having to look upon the smirking face of the very monster who destroyed your family. This unimaginable torment was inflicted on Patterson's, Maurer's, and Halveges' families solely because our justice system entertained Dupas' baseless appeals again and again. While upholding due process is important, surely the system failed in this case to adequately balance the rights of victims versus offenders. How many times should grieving families be forced to keep testifying and reliving the devastation? When does the offender's right to appeal end and the victim's right to move on begin? These questions have no simple answers, but Dupas' case highlighted glaring flaws in the appeals process that clearly re-victimized innocent families. As one analyst covering the trials reflected, this appeal sits in the system like a fishbone in the throat that can be neither coughed up nor swallowed. Meanwhile, the Halveges family and the prosecution witnesses still don't know whether the case is finished. Thankfully, reforms have now been implemented to prevent repetitive appeals from callously drawing out victims' suffering, as happened with Dupas. Judges can now dismiss frivolous appeals without court hearings, curtailing manipulative offenders' ability to misuse the appeals process. Also, police now have greater powers to more closely supervise parolees with violent histories using measures like electronic monitoring devices. Parole boards also now emphasize assessments of future risk rather than past good behavior when evaluating prisoners for release. These critical reforms aim to prevent another predator like Dupas from exploiting the system's blind trust to unleash further brutality. Broader attitudinal shifts also followed the Dupas case. His decade evading capture despite mountains of evidence embarrassed and galvanized Australian authorities. Police formed stronger multi-agency partnerships to close information loopholes that Dupas had slipped through. Forensics procedures were also systematized and comprehensively updated with the latest technology. Prosecutors similarly adopted more cooperative strategies to build ironclad cases against suspected serial killers. They recognized that the days of business as usual and siloed agencies enabled criminals like Dupas. But arguably the greatest impact was on public awareness. Extensive media coverage ensured average Aussies, not just officials, understood the Dupas case intimately. His legacy remains etched in the public conscience as a cautionary tale of systemic failure. Australians will not soon forget how an inept and fractured justice system gave Dupas endless license to kill. This heightened citizen scrutiny generated lasting pressure on leaders to implement the robust reforms described earlier. Of course, the scale of suffering Dupas inflicted can never be fully undone. Nothing could ever return the lives he stole or the emotional ruin left behind. But perhaps some solace can be found knowing that Marcina, Nicole, Margaret, and other victims did not die entirely in vain. Their lives memorialized vital lessons learned. Thanks to the difficult legacy left by Dupas' crimes, Australia now has stronger institutions to identify and restrain potential serial killers before they can murder unchecked. Other suspected killers roam free, no more because of the public outrage and real changes catalyzed by Dupas. His victims' suffering led to genuine positive impacts that have already likely spared innocent lives. In this small way, their devastating loss gave new meaning to those they left behind. Their lasting voices remind us to remain vigilant against evil and resolute in our shared humanity. By honoring their memories with compassion and practical reforms, we redeem goodness and progress from senseless tragedy. Their light continues shining despite the darkness that extinguished it. Thank you for joining us on this heartbreaking journey. Please take care of yourselves and cherish the blessing of safety and community. Before you leave, please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell. This will ensure you stay informed about the latest true crime cases we unravel. We're grateful to have you as part of our community as we delve into the captivating mysteries that continue to intrigue us all. Stay curious and remember that justice sometimes lurks in the darkest corners. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we eagerly anticipate seeing you in our next exploration.